Okay, we're going to get started here and expecting that people will be rolling in as they find parking and find the room. My name's Lisa Findley. I'm the Interim Dean of Architecture here at CCA, and we're most honored to welcome you all here this evening to host this event. Of course, this event really, in a really great way, connects to our fall lecture series, which has been called Other Ways of Working. And it picks up on CCA Architecture's continuing commitment to introduce our students to the myriad ways that architecture can be practiced or things that they can do with their architecture background. It's demonstrated by our faculty, it's brought into our curriculum, and it's discussed in our professional practice courses and in numerous history theory courses. And this idea of other ways of working is, of course, an apt description for the extraordinary process by which the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge works. It's been exciting to see how the challenge demands that architects and other designers work across different disciplines and different vantage points to proactively address climate resilience. CCA, of course, is very excited to be involved in the RBD. The Architecture Division is a core member of one of the 10 design teams, the one called the All Bay Collective, or ABC, which is comprised of AECOM, CMG, Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, and CCA's Urban Works Agency. The Urban Works Agency is a research lab of CCA Architecture's division, and it's led by Jeanette Kim. Jeanette, you want to wave? Who's one of the organizers of tonight's event, and Niraj Bhatia, who's our moderator this evening. In addition, CCA Architecture faculty Adam Marcus, Margaret Ikeda, and Evan Jones are members of another team, the one called Public Sediment. We're pleased to have worked with the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge organizers to make this event possible, and I'd like to welcome John Ram to say a few words about the challenge. John is a member of the RBD Executive Board and Planning Director of the City and County of San Francisco. John.
Thanks so much. Thank you to CCA for hosting tonight and for putting on this event. I'm really thrilled to be part of this whole effort. I will do a short plug for the Planning Department, who initially conceived of the idea of the RBD. And with my former colleague Gil Kelly, who has left us for the bright shores of Vancouver, BC. And really with his leadership and Diane Sokolov in the department kind of put together this concept of kind of replicating what New York did after Hurricane Sandy. But you know, what's happened since then is extraordinary with the whole RBD team under Amanda's leadership and Allison. So I'm just really thrilled to be here and to be on the board. I thought I'd say a few words, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the housing situation that we're in and kind of to set the stage for the panel, and then I'll introduce Niraj. You know, we are people keep calling it a housing crisis in the Bay Area in California, really in the country, but I think San Francisco is kind of the epicenter. And as I was saying this morning to some folks, there's a kind of perfect storm that's happened over the past decade here with a combination of the return of two cities of baby boomers and millennials, the largest cohorts in the U.S. population, right at the same time that the technology industry in the Silicon Valley and the rest of the country is exploding with growth. So the Bay Area actually has led the nation in terms of job growth as a percentage of existing jobs over the last decade. And that perfect storm has led us to where we are today, where we have the unfortunate distinction of being the highest cost big city in the U.S. And that is not a good thing, in my opinion. It might be good for some parts of the population, but for many folks, it becomes a huge crisis. The other stat I would share with you that is really, to me, exemplifies what the situation is we've been doing a lot of work on what we call the jobs housing balance regionally. And one stat that really has stuck out with me is that if we look over the last 5 decades of housing production in the Bay Area, every decade we have built fewer units than the previous decade. So that we are now in a situation where during this decade we will build half the number of units that we built in the 1970s. That is a problem. I mean, that is not a good thing. And when you have the population growth, the job growth, and the demand for housing in this region that we have got to turn this ship around. And the good news over the last year, maybe 18 months, there is a growing recognition among elected officials, among the many members of the public, enabled partially by the YIMBY movement and partially by others, to recognize that the law of supply and demand does matter, that building housing does in fact make a difference. Now, I want to caution you all by saying that's not going to solve the whole problem. We're not going to solve the housing crisis and suddenly make housing inexpensive by building 1 million new units. That's not going to work. It's part of the solution. And the challenge we then have is, how do we deal next 20 years with this crisis, with the extraordinary cost of housing, with the displacement that results as a result of this intense crisis, and with the crisis of affordability that is affecting a huge percentage of our population. So, and how do we make all that, how do we create resiliency in the housing market and truly create a city and a region that is available to everyone? And I am personally challenged by this in my role as planning director for the city. It's what keeps me up at night, to be frank. It's where I spend most of my time right now, is on this issue of housing development and housing affordability and displacement and those sorts of issues. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel tonight to talk about how we can kind of start tackling some of these issues in a more profound way. So with that introduction, I'll introduce Niraj Bhatia. Niraj is an architect and urban designer from Toronto. Welcome to the Great South. He describes his work as residing at the intersection of politics, infrastructure, and urbanism, which I think is pretty exciting. And he's an assistant professor here at the college, where he also directs the Urbanism Research Lab, which is called the Urban Works Agency. Prior to being here, Bhatia held teaching positions at Cornell University, Rice University, and the University of Toronto. And as I understand it, you're also on one of the design teams for the RBD. So, welcome.
Thank you, John. This is the last introduction of introductions tonight before we get to our awesome panelists here. Just quickly, I just want to thank Jeanette Kim for organizing this event, along with Amanda and Zoe. You guys really did an amazing job getting a lot of these speakers here today, as well as Lisa Finley Ardeen, who's, should I just do that? Cancel. Triple cancel. And as well as Lisa Finley. Before I introduce the presenters, I just want to say a very short word about resilience. If we understand this as a capacity to adapt and transform to anticipated and particularly unanticipated scenarios, housing in the Bay Area has remained fairly static in face of massive changes in the city, as John just pointed out. These include, but are not limited to, changing economics of land value, the dissolving of the nuclear family, and the creation of new family types, more nomadic ways that people are living and working, and with new technology, wholly new relationships between the public and private realm. Perhaps most importantly, as we know, there's been this slow process of urban development which has not been able to keep pace with the Bay Area's urbanization, leading to, among other things, sprawl across the landscape and precarious living conditions. And compounded with this, of course, for everyone in this room, sea level rise added to that. These are some of the issues that we've been tackling here at CCA and the Urban Works Agency over the past 3 years. And I'm really excited to have this amazing panel here today to discuss their work around housing. The format for tonight will be that each panelist will give a short presentation and followed by a moderated and quite open discussion with all of you guys. And we're going to try to leave as much time as possible for this discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists in order of their presentations. We're lucky to be joined by Carol Gallant, who is the Donald Turner Distinguished Professor in Affordable Housing and Urban Policy in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley, and she's also the Faculty Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. She also co-chairs the Policy Advisory Board of the Fisher Center of Real Estate and Urban Economics, and as Faculty Director for the Turner Center, Gallant oversees the center's work and co-leads the center's research agenda, supervising projects that identify, develop, and advance innovative solutions in local, state, and federal housing policy and practice. Prior to coming to UC Berkeley, Carol served in Obama's administration for over 5 years as the Assistant Secretary for Housing and the Federal Housing Commissioner at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Following Carol will be Tamika Moss. Tamika Moss is the Executive Director of Hamilton Families, which she joined just earlier this year in February 2017, coming there with more than 20 years of experience in nonprofit leadership and management experience. Tamika is locally and nationally recognized as a dynamic nonprofit leader with expertise in public policy and community planning. From 2014 to 2017, she served directly under the mayors of both San Francisco and Oakland. So I guess you were commuting back and forth across that bridge a lot. Most recently as Chief of Staff for Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf. Previously, she was Executive Director of Hope SF Initiative, and prior to that, amongst several other things, Tamika was Spur's Community Planning Policy Director. Following Tamika, we'll hear from Geeta Rao, who is the Senior Program Director of Sustainable Equitable Communities at Enterprise Community Partners. She brings 18 years of experience in affordable housing, community development, and transit-oriented development, including program design and administration, technical assistance, policy development and analysis, legislative advocacy, community organizing and planning, and coalition building. She most recently served as the initiative officer of the Great Communities Collaborative, housed at the San Francisco Foundation, where she managed an initiative that advances transit-oriented development to create sustainable and equitable communities in the Bay Area. And last but not least, Laura Foote-Clark, who's the Executive Director of YIMBY Action, a pro-housing advocacy nonprofit that fights for more infill housing at all levels of affordability to bring down the cost of living in San Francisco Bay Area and across the state of California. YIMBY Action activates people to engage with their local government to fight housing in every neighborhood. So without further ado, I want to pass the floor over to Carol. Thank you.
Arrow, got it. Thank you, and thank you all for being here and inviting me. This is the whole Resiliency by Design is a very exciting competition, and happy to be a part of it. I have the dubious task of giving you a big overview about the housing challenges, and so I'm going to try not to be too depressing, because it is quite a challenge, and also try to get to some opportunities and solutions in the design space as we move forward. So you heard in my bio our mission, and I just want to dive into the challenge. So starting with some depressing statistics to put really a frame on what John introduced in terms of the housing challenges in the Bay Area. I think it's pretty stark when you see that only 29% of Californians can afford to buy a median-priced home, and that figure, as depressing as that is, when you think about the fact that that is down from 55% in only 2012. So, like, not only is it a challenge, but it's gotten worse very quickly given the speedy recovery that we've had. And we have many Californians who are paying over 30% of their income for rent, and half of those, 1.5 million people, paying over 50% of their income for rent. We've got a challenge of, frankly, that we're in danger of stopping the kind of great economic recovery that we have by having more people move out of state and have jobs start to perhaps leave the state because the situation is becoming untenable for both employees and employers. And so that's something to really watch out for. As John mentioned, we have been underbuilding in California for decades, and this is a slide from the State Department of Housing and Community Development, which shows that in the short term, we need somewhere close to 180,000, some people will say 200,000 units a year just to keep up with our population growth and demand. And that's population growth not just from in-migration, but from people who are already here and forming new households and need places to live. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that interconnects with the climate change and resiliency issues as well. But I want to put an even finer point on what John said. So this is back to 1955, and you can see that it hasn't always been this way. There have been plenty of times in the state's history when we're building at the 200,000 or 300,000 units a year level. But what I want to draw your attention to in this slide is the green is single family homes, and the blue are multifamily. Now, those multifamily could be condominiums, they could be rental, but they're multifamily. And the reason I want to point that out is because it does relate to our climate change challenges. We were building a lot, but it doesn't mean we were building in the right places and at the right kind of physical structure that we want and need to be developing moving forward. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity, because now we want to be building those homes in urban infill locations at a higher density, and that in itself is a good thing, but it creates its own challenges. So we talked about the jobs, housing, and balance. We're generating a lot more jobs than we are housing, and that's a problem. The two other problems I just want to put on the list before we get to climate change and resiliency and solutions is we've at the same time, and this is an estimate of rental increases from Zillow, very hard to actually track real rental increases with publicly accessible data. So you can look at charts like this and they'll have all different kinds of curves depending on where you're pulling your data from. But the incomes, we know, were falling during the recession and are climbing back up, but not nearly at the rate needed to offset these high housing prices. This is a slide that I just want to emphasize as we talk about the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable people, those at the lowest income, and the intersection of paying attention to that as we develop in urban infill locations. So this is a map of the redlining maps that were developed by the government that frankly, by law created racial segregation, not just here, but throughout the country. And if you look at those red areas, this is Alameda County, Oakland, Berkeley, the low-lying areas, the areas that are not in the hills were redlined and disinvested in. And the Federal Housing Administration, which I ran in Washington back in these days, did not make loans in these red line neighborhoods. So we have a whole generation of people who lived in these communities who could not access the wealth building of home ownership until way into the 60s and 70s. And I think people can't forget that history as we're going back and wanting to redevelop and develop these communities. We have to pay attention to the displacement challenges that also brings. So now I just want to turn to resiliency and climate change, just talk about the fact that California also has very strong goals for reducing greenhouse gas, and land use patterns and where we build play a role in that. And this chart just shows the greenhouse gas or emissions essentially from passenger vehicles and what are most passengers doing in those passenger vehicles, but they're commuting to and from work. So it used to be drive for affordability. The farther out you live, the less expensive your home can be, and that's a pattern we want to change, to meet some of these climate change goals. But again, we got to marry that with the displacement issues in vulnerable communities, and building resiliency. So just to conclude on the particular challenges that I see, and we are part of the All Bay Collaborative team, that the climate change that we're concerned about leads to a significant impact, not just on the environment, but on the availability and cost of housing in the region. And so we have to be preparing for that. With sea level rise, with the fires, we know that we're going to have disrupted housing stock, which means even fewer places for people to live on a temporary basis and maybe even long term. And that then we often will get increased restrictions as a result of these disasters that make it more difficult and expensive to build. And so I think that's, if there's a number one challenge to the design teams, it is thinking about how to design in cost-effective ways, which I'll end on in just a minute. So that increased cost is like one more challenge. We want to do the right thing, but we have that challenge. So I think there are some solutions to this that I just want to mention briefly. One is to do a lot more in the Bay Area around industrialized construction or off-site construction or modular construction, however you want to term it. You can build much less expensively in a factory off-site than you can building on-site. You can build more quickly, and this is an opportunity to change materials, to change designs, and it's something that I think really should be embraced. And we should also look at the opportunity here when we're redeveloping and planning for resiliency to really think about creating more land and creating more land by higher density and other kinds of innovative design schemes in and around waterways, for example. And then we need to look at potential new funding streams to pay for some of these costs. And I do think in California, the focus on climate change gives us some opportunities like the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Fund that comes out of the cap and trade dollars that get set aside to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there's an opportunity there for these sites to tap in to that kind of funding. So with that, I think I'm going to stop. I don't know whether I met my 7-minute mark, but I tried. Thank you.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me out tonight. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with these lovely women, and Carol is one of my heroes in the field, so it's especially an honor to follow that context and setting. And I don't have slides for you today because I actually want to have a conversation about the intersection of resilience and people. And I think it's really important to, as the design teams think about what you're designing for and who you're designing for, it's really important to start with where the people intersect with all of the issues that we talk about. And I want to kind of lead in talking a little bit about some personal resilience that I've experienced, where when I was 12 years old and my house burned down, and we were without a home for 2.5 years, and we relied on our family and social networks to support us through the 2-year period that it took for my family to rebuild their home. Those are the kinds of social networks that many of our folks who are in our most vulnerable and impacted communities don't have access to. So it's really important to think about how the shocks and threats that happen when you think about resilience most negatively impact our most vulnerable communities and our most impacted communities. And I think it's really important to, when we can design solutions that actually make sure we lift up our most vulnerable individuals, our folks of color, our low-income communities, then everybody wins. It really is an opportunity for us to have both political will and policies that are focused and not I sort of describe it as the peanut butter effect, where we try to have a little bit for everyone and we spread it out, and we're afraid to focus our resources and energies in places and on people that matter the most. And so I think it's really important as you think about resilience in design to be unafraid about focusing in on the vulnerability of the folks who are going to be most impacted when a natural disaster, climate change, and the other sort of environmental or social situations happen in communities. So I want to just sort of ground us in that and talk a little bit more about that specifically. You know, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about resilience is collaboration. And I think people use that word interchangeably with a variety of other words. You hear sort of coordination, alignment, et cetera. And what I mean by collaboration is being able to bring folks together from various sectors. We're not going to solve any of these problems that we're going to talk about tonight by ourselves. The government isn't going to solve it. The private sector is not going to solve it. We must actually come together around a common goal that's going to have the most impact for the communities that we care about. And so when we talk about collaboration in your design, really talking about how do we not just line up next to each other, but how do we get into conversations and strategies that force us to do and be different in those relationships so that we actually come together strategically around a more significant impact. So collaboration, both in the design process, but also in resilience, is what's going to actually give us those tools to have the right folks at the table working together in concert. And, you know, you're going to hear a lot of sort of depressing language today, and I want to just sort of reframe that a little bit to talk about, for me, it's sobering. It can be motivational because it actually, if it's depressing, it's often the reaction to do nothing. It's so bad that we can't fix it. But there actually are solutions out there that we are testing and piloting in communities, in regions across the Bay Area that are working. So I want to just challenge us a little bit to not think that we are depressed by way of not being able to take action, but try to be motivated by the sobering reality that so many of the folks in the Bay Area are experiencing. So partnerships matter. How many folks hear about public-private partnerships? All the time, right? And you know, it's sort of jargon and language, but in fact, I think it's a structure that Resilience by Design is also thinking about. We have to create partnerships where we build both investment, political will, whatever it's going to take to tackle these issues at scale. And at Hamilton Families, we actually have had a really interesting opportunity to work with the City and County of San Francisco, the Mayor's Office, the San Francisco Unified School District, as well as private philanthropy to see what we can do about interrupting the cycle of homelessness for families. And we were able to work together to create a theory of change where we used data from the school district that indicated that there are over 2,100 students in the San Francisco Unified School District that are homeless every single night in San Francisco. And when we came together and decided that that was unacceptable, that we want to collectively do something about that, then we were able to formulate a partnership to raise $30 million over the next 3 years to house 800 additional families as quickly as we can to ensure that we can interrupt that cycle for the children who are experiencing homelessness. So it's those kinds of partnerships and sort of discipline around making sure you see the partnerships through and not just investing in the beginning when it's a good idea, but actually staying with the ideas to make sure that the interventions are really working. So that kind of discipline is really important in partnerships, and I just want to encourage the design teams as you think about implementation, who are your partners? How do you make sure that everyone can see themselves in the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and making sure that you get the right people at the table? So this is also one of the moments in my remarks where I talk about data. So you know that we have tons of data that sort of confirm the enormity of the challenges that we have. But what I find is that you don't get to just dislike the data when it doesn't tell the story that you want to hear. Let me say that once more, right? Like, you can't decide that the data doesn't matter because you have a different story you want to tell. And so it's really important to make sure that when you look for solutions and interventions to these challenges, that they are data informed, that they are evidence-based, and that then once you use the data to inform where you need to put your investments. What should you try? Where should you iterate? How do you pilot ideas to ensure that when you find solutions that work, and I believe Hamilton Families has actually done a really good job over our 32-year history of finding those suites of things that actually can end family homelessness, then you double down. You invest, you stay committed, and you see it through. Because the worst thing we can do in the crisis that we're in is house all of these families. And frankly, we are housing, over the last 3 years, we typically support it, and we do housing through rental subsidies primarily. So that's the way in which we are able to scale the work that we do. And for most of our history, we have housed families in San Francisco. And the way our program works is we have a subsidy program where we support folks to get into housing. We provide the rental subsidy for up to 2 years, and we work with the families to increase their household income over time to take over the subsidies. Well, in 2014, there's been a shift in how many families can actually stay in San Francisco. John talked about the housing crisis. I mean, you know, we built 55,000 housing units over the last decade, and we added 400,000 plus jobs, right? Like, the imbalance is insane. And so low-income families, formerly homeless families, and people cannot actually afford to be here. So 75% of families that we are housing today are being housed outside of the city and county of San Francisco. They're disconnected from their community connections and networks. Their children are having to find new schools and resources in these communities. So it's forcing us to think regionally about how are we geographically looking at the impacts of the people that are most impacted by our transportation infrastructure not being sufficient enough to get families from as far as Sacramento back to their jobs in San Francisco. So the last piece I want to talk about is a regional approach. I think it is critical that as you do the design work and you think about how we're going to have the most impact in the Bay Area, we have to think regionally. And it's not just a terminology where it's like, yes, we are one Bay Area. We actually have to act regionally. We have to do the hard work of thinking about what does resource sharing look like when a family or a person lives in San Francisco and they relocate to Vallejo. How do we make sure that they're able to access resources and benefits? Because people are mobile. Our youth are mobile, our families are mobile. We all have friends and family who live all around the region. And unless we're able to make the connections for people who are most vulnerable to be successful in those new communities, then we are actually we're not solving the problem. So I think it's important for us to recognize what kinds of infrastructure we need to build to be resilient. There actually isn't a very strong regional governance in the Bay Area. We don't actually have an amazing regional transit system in the Bay Area. Fremont is like Fremont, and San Francisco, and so we have our own identities, but we have the same problems. And so you may find local solutions, but you have to be able to think regionally if you're going to have collective impact. And I think it's really important through this resilience process. Carol and I and Geeta, many of us sit at many different tables talking about these issues from different vantage points. But when I think about homelessness, to me, homelessness is a symptom of many failed systems, not only in the Bay Area, but across this entire country. And unless we start to unpack the intersectionality of those failed systems, then we're always going to be chasing the tail and trying to, decide whether or not we can have compassion for people who are on our streets when we all know as as humans, that it is dehumanizing to accept that people are living on our streets in one of the richest places in the world. And so I just encourage you all to think regionally, think about partnerships, collaboration, real collaboration, not just in name only, and really use data to make sure that you are targeting the people who need resilience the most. So thank you so much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Hi there, I'm Geetha Rao and I'm with Enterprise Community Partners, and it is such a delight to be on a panel with these very lovely ladies. I love all lady panels. They rarely happen, actually, so taking it in. And my job here, Carol talked about the big trends happening regionally. Tamika brought the people perspective and also the systems perspective. And I actually usually live in the region. I'm always thinking like a regionalist. But today I actually want to talk about at the neighborhood level and at the building level. So, these are images that are seared into our mind when disaster hits, right? And as thinking about what Tamika said, the people who are hit the hardest are low-income communities of color. They're the most vulnerable. Has everybody seen this map? I'm sure, right? That's another image that's probably seared into your mind, right? These are the communities that are most vulnerable when disaster hits. And what I appreciate this, and BCDC put this together, is they actually give us indicators. So getting back to data, we know we can predict who is going to be most impacted when not hurricane for us, but when sea level rise happens and various other disasters happen. And it's these communities that we really have to have at the center of our resiliency work, right? We need to plan and we need to design and we need to implement with these communities in mind. Because if we do that for these communities, everybody will benefit, right? We'll all benefit. And this is called the curb cut effect. Do people know Angela Blackwell Glover and her thinking? That, in Berkeley in the 1960s, there were disability advocates who, in the very first curb cut that went in, everyone said, oh, that's fine, it's just going to help people in wheelchairs. But that's not true, right? All of us benefit from curb cuts when we have our kids in strollers and when we push our suitcases. And so when we design for resiliency, thinking of the most vulnerable, we'll have the greatest impacts across the region. So I want to talk a little bit about what's being done around housing and resiliency. So why start from housing? Well, it's pretty basic. When you are a family and you, especially if you are a low-income family and you are hit by disaster, you have to leave your home. Your home is flooded, and if we're entering the housing market again, you're going to really struggle. It is nearly impossible to find a home. Most low-income families, they rent. They rent in the market where there's very little protection for them. And so that family, once they are displaced from their home, they're finding themselves outside of the Bay Area. They're finding themselves in Tracy and Stockton, and they're commuting very long distances, and they're detached from their communities and from services. And arguably, that's worse for the environment, right, with GHG emissions. And so affordable housing is an actual building that is permanently affordable. It's for that family who lives there, they're not at the whim of the market. They can live in affordable housing and it's stable, and then they can rebuild their lives. And oftentimes, affordable housing is built to the highest green standards, and it's managed by mission-driven developers. So it is a product that, as you create your designs, it's important to think about what it means, how you can meet the needs of the most vulnerable people with affordable housing. So I work at Enterprise. We are a national organization, and our mission is to create opportunity for low and moderate income people through affordable housing, and we do this through capital, solutions, and policy. And we actually have a resiliency practice at Enterprise. It was started after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and Enterprise came in and helped rebuild the public housing. And we also helped rebuild the public housing after Hurricane Sandy. And currently, we do have a fund set up for hurricane recovery that I'm trying to get expanded to wildfires here in California. And as you think of your designs, I just want to share a couple of resources that may be helpful to you. One of them is the Ready to Respond Strategies for Multifamily Building Resilience. And so this is really at the building scale, a little bit at the neighborhood scale as well. And it talks about what are the design strategies to consider when you're designing resilient buildings in neighborhoods. And also, you may want to also look at the green criteria that we've developed over the course of 10 years, actually. And lastly, well, not lastly, I'm halfway through my presentation, and what I really want to showcase is the work that we're doing in Sustainable Chinatown. And the reason why I want to showcase this is that oftentimes I find that projects that have multiple goals around equity and environment or sustainability, one of them wins out. Like it's always like the equity that wins out or it's sustainability that wins out. And why I think this project is really important is because they're very interrelated and both goals are actually achieved. And so to what Tamika was saying around partnerships, this was a project that was initiated by the Chinatown Community Development Center. So it's in San Francisco's Chinatown. The other partners include the planning department, enterprise, and the environment. And this project really couldn't have been made possible unless that collaboration was there and that we were really trying to understand each other's goals. So there are three main parts of this mission. There are three parts of this mission that are interconnected. One of them is around sustainability, to sustain Chinatown's unique cultural history. The other one is around affordability, to maintain the affordability in the neighborhood and along the businesses, and also to improve the environmental performance. And so when you talk to partners who are involved in Sustainable Chinatown, they will say, we can make the greenest, most resilient neighborhood in Chinatown, but if the residents don't live there or if they have been displaced, then we've failed our mission. So why Chinatown? So remember those indicators that I had showed earlier? Well, Chinatown very much aligns with that. It's one of the last affordable neighborhoods in San Francisco, and it's a gateway for immigrants and low-income people. The median income is around $18,000. 62% of the population doesn't speak English. 80% of the residents are Asian. A third of the residents are seniors, and 94% of the population rents, and 40% in SROs. And so SROs they're small rooms. They're 8 by 10. And a lot of Chinatown is already green by necessity. Right? 75% of the families don't own cars, and there is, resources are pretty precious there. So when you look at the water use, it's pretty low. It's also a neighborhood that's facing immense gentrification pressures. An SRO a couple years ago used to rent for about $700 a month, and that was a family typically lives in there. Here's a picture of that. And now that unit is going for $1,400 a month. And so when you're very low income, that is the vast majority of your income. And Carol and I were just talking about how I thought she was going to put in a slide for the urban displacement project, and she thought I was going to put in a slide for the urban displacement project. But I do want to highlight the work that is coming out of UCB, because when you do your resiliency work, I really do hope that you're looking at the maps and really understanding the neighborhoods that are most impacted by displacement. So how is resiliency built into this project? There are lots of infrastructure projects that are happening right now in Chinatown. Probably the most notable is the Central Subway. And these are projects that have been vetted, with the help of the planning department for years. But what we're trying to do with Sustainable Chinatown is get an actual green scope implemented. And so as you design, it's kind of important to think about, okay, what are the big infrastructure projects or opportunities that are emerging, and how can we embellish them with a green scope? So right now, the conversations are happening around Portsmouth Square. It is very much the living room of the entire community in Chinatown. Those rooms are tiny. So when you go to Portsmouth Square, people are on the plaza. People bring their own furniture. They bring little chairs and they sit because they're there for hours. And some of the conversations that have come up is, we're thinking about stormwater recapture and all that stuff. But one of the ideas that has emerged is, let's create Portsmouth Square as a resiliency center. It's the place where everybody goes to. It's a place where we can connect connect with our networks, we can charge our cell phones, we can get food and water, and so it can really become a central part of the community. And so those conversations are right now in the design phase, and in the next year we'll see where the Resiliency Center lands. Another opportunity is through public housing. So this is Ping Yuan. It's over 1,400 units, so quite a bit. And it is a considerable housing stock in China. So Chinatown is really built out, right? It is dense, it's built out. They have hundreds of owners. Properties are in family associations. So you're like, where's the opportunity for housing? Well, part of the opportunity comes when you are once again upgrading. And so the public housing here was upgraded through the RAD program, which included 14 other properties. And there is a deep green scope. There's the baseline green scope, and there's also photovoltaics. And one of the things that didn't end up happening, which is a little bit of my heartbreak, is a gray water system, but that would have been pretty amazing. The other thing that this project is looking at, and you'll see the red lines there, is they're looking at an infill scope, right? So all that area, when you think of Chinatown, it's these tiny little parcels, but they're like, how can we fit more housing in there? So even in places where you don't think you can build, you can actually build. So this is just an overall map of the project. I'm actually going to keep going here because I feel like I'm running out of time. But there are opportunities with the SFPUC working on district-wide approaches to green infrastructure around water. And here are the strategies. And you can just go to sustainablechinatown.org, its website, to go deeper in this. And here's some of our accomplishments. So we did get the solar at the Ping Yuans. We've gotten grant funding to sustain the collective impact model, and we also have money set aside for a temporary ground play project, which will eventually lead to permanent funding for something bigger. But once again, I can't underscore how important it is to do resiliency work with community. This is the organizing work that happens continually in Chinatown, that's led by Chinatown CDC. I don't know if a green project would have emerged on its own if it hadn't come from this place, if it hadn't come from people who are like, okay, yeah, we want to improve Portsmouth Square, but what can we do to maximize resiliency? And in order for these projects, the Ping Yuans even showed us that what took those projects to be successful was a deep partnership. No one sector can go alone at this at all. So I just want you to encourage, when you think about the implementation plan, what are the assets and what are the people? And who's going to hold it beyond the plan getting done?
Hi, Laura Clark. I do politics, which has nothing tangible about it. So we advocate for building a lot more housing. We go and yell at hearings. We try to get other people to go and yell at hearings. You heard my bio was really short because I don't have anything on my resume that makes me a person worth listening to. I worked at a farmer's market. I went to college. It was great. And I worked as a photographer on a tour boat going out to the Statue of Liberty. No experience necessary. In fact, most of my jobs that I have had no experience necessary. I think all of them. And that's kind of what's great about politics and also what's sometimes terrible about it. I have a joke that I think this crowd will think is funny, which is the barrier to entry in local politics is like our bike infrastructure. It's not really there, it's painted on the ground. That joke kills urbanists. Haha, sometimes it just maims them. Anybody can get involved in local politics, and actually everyone has to. So which way does the clicker go? Who are the people that I'm organizing? We believe in cities. We believe we can build dense, vibrant cities, thriving, human-centric places where we have transit and walkable neighborhoods, but they have to be continuously built. This isn't a one-time project. You do not build a city once. You don't come up with one good plan. In fact, you are consistently ever growing and changing. They are growing organisms. And that means that the laws have to work, because the laws are what you are building off of. They cannot be achieved with our current housing and transportation policies. They are holding us back fundamentally. We talked a lot about this. This is one of the maps that's like, hey, jobs, housing balance. It is a crazy situation that our economy has been growing for a while, and that's been a bad thing for people. That is not a traditional thing in the history of human civilization. That means that we are doing something very, very wrong here. People are commuting longer and longer and longer. I think we all know this. There are 1,000 stats that we can do to express what we all know in our gut when you have millennials moving back home and living in the basement. We all know that this is a crisis. If we care about climate change, this is also important. The longer the commute is, the more carbon people are emitting, the bigger the sprawl is, the further people are pushed out who would be working in these jobs and are therefore commuting hours and hours. One of the statistics that I find the most heartbreaking is the longer your commute is, the worse your kid does in school. And when you are talking about pushing low and middle income people further and further out, you're talking about adding increased hardship on low income people as they are pushed further and further away from the jobs that are here in this place. These are reasons to care. I'm sure that we could do hand raising, other reasons to care. Cutting your carbon emissions, racial integration, social justice, cars are awful and deadly, walkability, there's access to job here, childhood poverty, homelessness, reducing sprawls, biking deaths, that's one that I got doored somewhat recently. Access to services, overall health, when you walk, you're less fat. Economic integration. There are tons of reasons to be for dense, walkable, vibrant, transit-oriented cities. Pick one, and I'm sure you all already agree with me. We are already in crisis. That is a fundamental thing to really understand. We've heard a lot of the statistics already. One that I think we should be thinking about extra right now is what's happening in Napa and Sonoma. They were already in crisis. From 2007 to 2014, Napa and Sonoma built about 70% of their housing goals. So the low-income people who wanted to be living there and who were probably working in Napa and Sonoma were already in crisis. And homeowners have insurance, and renters, and especially low-income renters, do not have insurance. And those are the people who are going to be permanently damaged by this. I think it's great that a lot of the panelists have talked about if we do things for the lowest and the most vulnerable among us, we are going to help everyone. What is going to be rebuilt in Napa and Sonoma? It's not like they're upzoning their towns right now. There's no emergency upzoning happening right now to make sure that when they rebuild, they're building multifamily housing to make sure that the low income and minority people are able to actually return and thrive there. I think that many of the homeowners are going to have homeowners insurance and be able to rebuild the single family ranch house. But what is going to happen next? I don't think anybody is pushing that hard enough because in a disaster, we don't think about how our laws need to change. And it's important to really understand this. I can't say this enough. The problem is political. We have legislated a housing shortage into existence. Sometimes I hear millennials eat too much avocado toast, and that's why they can't afford housing. Or that this is I think it was great, Carol Galanti talking about creating more land through density. There's this magical air land where you can put housing. We can do these things. And it's actually not rocket science. It's the opportunity for really awesome and cool design. But people have been building cities for a millennia. And so we just have to embrace all of the great energy in this room and allow it to be built. And that means doing politics. We have two kind of big overarching things that keep us from building the housing that we need. We have restrictive zoning and we have a slow permitting process. I think that when I used to come and yell at the permitting process, as John Ram can attest, when I started showing up, I was a nervous, angry person who had no right to be there and was just yelling all the time. And I would say, what are these continuances? Why are you having another continuance? What do you have to think about? We just spent 6 hours and I sat through this effing hearing and you're not even going to make a decision? Like, I came here to give my public comment and you promised me it wasn't a waste of my time. No such promise. We have a third of the city right now that is zoned single-family home only, where it is illegal to build apartment buildings. We have the entire Bay Area that is mostly zoned such that housing will not be built. And I think we talked about redlining. It was originally deliberately designed to keep low-income and minority people out of those neighborhoods, and it has been very successful at doing that. We have our slow permitting process. Affordable housing, the subsidized affordable housing stuff, especially in the suburbs, is the stuff that is the most vulnerable to our slow, cumbersome, and awful entitlement process, where people get up there and with a straight face say, I don't want those people in my neighborhood. And the things that come out of people's mouths, man, I knew Trump was gonna get elected because, yeah. So I'm sorry, John Ram, that I'm putting this one up here. But I think it's important also, they put it, this is the San Francisco Planning Department. So it's in Comic Sans to make it seem like it's friendly. And also, the green returned to step one multiple times. You thought you were making progress, but no, return to step one in friendly green. Also, the Post-it note for environmental review, like that cracks me up so much because like that is one hell of a Post-it note. By the way, you're going to have to do another EIR. I don't know, every one of these steps has a place where all it takes is one person saying, I don't want those people living near me to stop and reset and add another 6 months to a year and thousands of dollars to a project. And missing middle is the thing we talk about all the time. This is where it's missed. This is where we lose it, is in this process. These hearings are terrible. I mean, and I'm about to tell you that you have to come. But you also have to live tweet because that's the only thing that's going to keep you sane. Hearings like this are a deliberate barrier to sane people engaging in the process. When decisions get made at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday, who do you think is showing up? Show of hands, you all are crazy urbanists. How many of you have been to more than one planning commission hearing? And I'm talking about one that isn't your project. Right? That's not, that you all should be showing up for each other's projects. That is the only way that we can deal with the current system, because the current system demands a bunch of people shouting all the time. I really appreciate that this is resilience by design, and I hope that means you guys are going to fight for your designs, because this comic is extremely accurate. What the family wanted, what the bank would finance, what the city would allow, what got built. That is what we see over and over and over again. We have a lot of plans, and we don't execute them. And I don't blame Mr. Ram for that. That's a political problem. That is because we have decided that we do not have the willpower to follow through on a lot of these plans, because they take showing up and yelling right now at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday. We have about 101 municipalities making up the Bay Area. We talked a lot about regionalism. We have a lot of reasons why this fragmented decision-making does not currently work. You talk about local officials and local incentives. When you draw the political boundaries extremely small, you select for people having parochial interests. And how many of you read a national newspaper every day? Pretty much. How many of you read a local blog like every day? Yeah. Oh, nice. Okay, so there's hope for you guys. A lot of these decisions get made in obscure hearings where the local official knows that the only people who are going to be paying attention to that decision are the people who have direct interest in that project. They know that the surrounding neighbors will never forget what decision they made, but the general good is constantly thwarted. We're already in crisis. I want to say this again. YIMBY often gets critiqued for being overly simplistic in our advocacy, and it sometimes boils down really to if a person lives in it, we are for it. And that's true. If a person lives in it, we are for it. But when a region systematically fails at the basics, you get simplistic solutions. We need more housing. We need more transit. We need other good things, but we need a lot more housing, and we need to continuously build housing and transit and housing and transit. And it took a long time for us to get in this hole, and we need to get out of it really frickin' fast. Politics is about simple, bold messaging, and that get hopefully at basic truths. And that is what we need to be engaging in, is talking about these big, basic truths of what we need to do and how we need to change it. Sometimes we can get sidetracked by people who want to add a lot of complexity to the issue and want to say, slow down, we need to think this all the way through, and, your messaging is like, really, we need to really think this all the way through. We do need to think it all the way through, and we need to stay committed to our values through that process and stay committed to a level of urgency. Just because you're thinking something through does not mean you slow down. We are in crisis. The solution is political. We have to change the way decisions are made. We have to change the laws. Politicians change laws. Politicians get to the heads of parades. We need a parade. We need people contacting their elected officials all the time. We need people picking up the phone. We need people sending emails. We need people following projects in their neighborhood and actually sending, every time you get a little neighborhood notification, just say send an email. Yes, I support it. This is what a parade looks like. You can join ours, or you can join any of the other people's here. But every developer, every affordable housing developer, you can contact them and say, how can I make sure that I show up to every hearing where you need humans to support your projects? Thanks.
Thank you all for those amazing presentations, inspiring and sobering at the same time, depending on the moment today. We have about half an hour to 40 minutes for discussion. I'll just kick off one question and then really open it up to the audience, as I'm sure a lot of you guys have questions as well. I was just curious, it was mentioned that a lot of land will be unleashed during the various schemes and strategies, land that is either industrial land right now that is going to be remediated, or potentially the production of new land through sediment management. Do we need to rethink the way that land, once it's built, how it's subdivided or owned, or if ownership is still the goal when producing housing today? Or should there be other ways that we actually just think about how to evaluate, subdivide, and manage that land in other systems? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay.
I'll take it. So there's no
Sorry,
feedback.
awkward. Okay, is this working? Cool. So right now, there are a lot of incentives that make it more valuable for someone to own land in California than to rent. There are a lot of benefits that we give to owners that we don't give to renters. And it creates all these perverse incentives for people to consistently want their property values to be ever escalating, to treat housing as an investment rather than as shelter. And I think that we need to really rethink the way we do our tax structure, cough, cough, Prop 13, and we need to rethink, yes, I would say ownership should not be treated, in a well-functioning housing market, the difference between renting and owning should not be large, and we should have the ability for people to move. Yeah, anybody else want to pile on?
I won't exactly pile on, but I will say that I think there is a value to home ownership, that it is the largest way that most people who are in the middle class have actually gotten there in terms of creation of their wealth. So if we decide that home ownership is not an important goal, we absolutely must, as a country, think about how you get that savings and wealth building in some other mechanism, because I don't think you want to get rid of it, particularly as older wealthy white people have their wealth now, and so now we're going to cut off a path for people who don't have that wealth, to find a path to get it. So I think I'd be careful about that. On the other hand, I will say, as a response to this question, I think there should be a lot of more hybrid forms of ownership, both for individuals, lease purchase, shared equity, we don't really have a good co-op system in California, so more affordable ways of having ownership, I think, certainly would be positive strategies. And the last thing I would say, we have to rethink, I believe, public ownership. So how we use, there's going to be a lot of public infrastructure in these designs that we're talking about, right? Being much more creative about the use of that public land for also private activities, including places for people to live. And I think that is absolutely possible as part of some of these infrastructure projects.
I just wanted to add to Carol, I think some of the most exciting work happening in the region right now is around public land. There's the backdrop of the surplus surplus law, state surplus, something law. And when a public entity disposes of land, the first right of refusal has to go to an affordable housing developer. And MTC is in the process of looking at a land study all the way down from Marin down to Santa Clara County. And there's like thousands of pieces of land. It resides within the school district. It resides within, BART alone owns 260 acres of land. And so that is just a huge asset that's really underutilized right now that our region needs to get its head around, and trying to use the best use of those parcels for the greatest public good.
And I would just add that, there's a lot of debate in communities where there's actually a lot of land, like in Oakland, for example, where there's a lot of old industrial land that could be converted for different uses. And there's a real tension between should that land be preserved for jobs or should it be preserved for housing? And how do you make the balance based on the needs? And I think it's important to really think about what Carol talked about earlier, where communities who have been intentionally left out of wealth building, living in communities where environmental conditions are poor, the negative impacts of the industrial lands that remain in communities are disproportionately impacting the folks who are still living there, and yet they've never been actually able to generate wealth through home ownership. And so it's a really interesting sort of dynamic about, I really appreciate the comment about creating opportunities for asset building. As long as the United States uses property as an asset, we should not exclude our most vulnerable communities in even thinking that that's their right, because that's a cultural norm in many low-income communities that they are only relegated to rentals. So it's both what do our policies and sort of interventions need to do, but it's also helping low-income folks feel like they should too be able to own property and fulfill whatever that American dream looks like in their family or community.
I just have to add one little thing to the public land, because I totally agree with Gita about use of public land that's surplus. But my big bugaboo is we have to think about underutilized public land and how we mix the public uses and private uses. And how many people here live in San Francisco? And how many people have been to the DMV site on Fell Street? I mean, if there's a piece of frickin' underutilized land in this city, that is it. And if you live in Oakland, you can pick out, same thing. I think it's about 3 acres of parking with a 10,000 square foot little building, 1 story on it. Now, and I actually tried to pry that land out of the hands of the state of California, not, on a land lease. Like, let's lease that, let's deck that parking structure, keep all that place for parking and driving, and add residences above it. I mean, like, it is so the right solution and ever so difficult to do.
Questions from the audience? Do you want, or-
Hello. So bear with me for a little while, okay? So you talked about political will, okay? I went to Finland like 4 years ago, and I was on this highway, and I saw a sign that said, "In this country, a child will not starve," since 1944. That's political will, okay? This is the 6th richest economy in the world, okay? I'm from Peru. I'm part of a team. We went today to Pier 70. Gigantic, massive, huge infrastructure that's going to be built into retail and whatnot. And I thought this could be an amazing site to densify affordable housing. Now, these different concepts need one thing. We need to raise the level of consciousness to understand what resilience is. Because if we don't do that, we'll be repeating the same mistake over and over and over again. There's no way that this state cannot have the political will to feed somebody, to be able to understand what is the need to have a house. So we need to raise the bar. We need to understand what is resilience in terms of climate change, raising the consciousness. If we don't have that, we're going to be discussing these opportunities while the people who are in power will not be able to change their mindset. So that is the big challenge. That's the way I see it. Thanks.
So I kind of want to respond because I think the bar's lower than that. I think that most people's consciousness is actually already there. It's just not organized, and it doesn't connect with where the decisions are actually getting made. I think, most of the time when you poll San Franciscans, you say, do you think we should be building more housing? They're like, yes. Do you think we should have more transit? Yes. Do you think that our neighborhoods should be more walkable? Yes. You get stray polls, but the poll numbers come in at the direction. San Francisco is already 70% renter. People know that the rent is too high, and people know that there should be a lot more housing being built in this city. It's just that is not politically true because it's not organized politically. It's not organized into people canvassing for their hyper-local candidate. It's not people engaging with the planning commission. The connection between where and when the decisions get made and what people might believe is not there. That's at least what I hope as somebody who plans to change things.
Yeah, I want to just thank you for your comments because I want to say amen. And I think part of the challenge is we're not going to solve these problems locally, right? We've had a 80% reduction in our HUD funding for housing production over the last 20 years. So when you think about where we are prioritizing our resources and who is responsible for that social safety net or ensuring that resources where we live out sort of the values of this country, which are about not having human suffering on our streets. I mean, to me, there are advocates who advocate for homelessness, for homeless people to have voice. And the voice should be talking about how inhumane it is to allow any of our residents in any community to be on our streets. And so I think there's a disconnect between what our progressive narrative is and how it actually shows up in our communities. Because there's not a through line that forces people to raise to that level of consciousness and make sure that what we are doing actually has the impact that we believe in. And personally, I've spent most of my career in this conundrum. And then I just want to go shop because I'm like, I don't know what else to do. But, you know, that's when I'm having my weak moments.
If I could just say one other thing on the politics, because I think it is sobering. So while many people do have the right values, I will just go back to, and I teach a little bit about this in, U.S. housing policy. This country was founded on rugged individualism. That's a fact, okay? And, deeply embedded in this, yes, people care, but there also is a deeply embedded national culture of up by the bootstraps. We're going to do it as individuals. It's not a collective mentality. It's the United States, but the states have a lot of rights. I mean, like, if we just go all back to the political system, we don't have a good culture of thinking collectively.
While I would say that's definitely true of places in the Bay Area, I feel like it's less true in San Francisco, and I'm kind of curious about how in San Francisco there is this very strong progressive narrative that gentrification, that development equals gentrification. And I'm kind of curious, what can we do to change that narrative? Because, I mean, I'm very sensitive to the concerns about gentrification. I think we all are. But I think we also need to address all these issues, and all these issues are things that often bump up against a certain argument out there that talks about Manhattanization or displacement and so on.
Is that one mine?
Yeah, well, Laura's clearly going to want to talk about this, but I would just say, and call me Pollyanna, I do think that evidence matters. Back to Tamika's point, and it's the evidence about new construction creating the displacement, is absolutely is not, the evidence is not there for that. The evidence is simply not there. Now, there's some fuzzy places, where in any particular micro neighborhood that was disinvested in for years, and all of a sudden the Transportation Commission and others put major public improvements in these areas, and all of a sudden make them more investable as communities. Does that put pressure in a micro neighborhood level? And in some cases, I think that's true. And I think the answer there is, though, showing those pieces of evidence, and also showing that in those micro locations where those public investments could contribute to more gentrification, we should be, having policies that address that as we're doing the planning. So that, at least that's, what I preach.
I think you have to be really understanding of two different kinds of people who end up calling themselves progressives in the city. You have people who are genuine, like people who are under threat of gentrification, who have watched everyone they know, displaced by this, and who are under immense pressure, who, are living in really often terrible situations, and who I have nothing but understanding for. And you have people who wrap themselves in the cloak of it, and who call themselves environmentalists while fighting infill housing. You have, a lot of West Side homeowners who, that coalition that was forged in the city between people who I would call NIMBYs, people who actually don't want things in their neighborhoods, who want single-family home-only neighborhoods, versus low-income activists who feel like they're defending their neighborhood from a very genuine place. There's a coalition that was forged in San Francisco, especially a while ago. And the history of that, we were doing horrific things to our cities for decades. We were blasting through our cities and declaring low-income neighborhoods blighted and literally destroying whole neighborhoods. We we, for a long time, did tear down existing low-income housing and build a giant, lush condo building that maybe had exactly the same number of units in it. You know, we did terrible things to our cities for decades, and the alliance that was forged out of that between people who think of themselves as environmentalists, right, and they wanted to stop all big things. That was kind of the 70s environmentalist movement, was to say, stop doing big things. And then low-income people who wanted to literally protect their neighborhoods from redevelopment coming through and destroying their homes made a lot of sense at that time. And now it doesn't make so much sense, but that's also not my place to say. You know, so fundamentally, I don't think that people necessarily change their minds. I think that there are people in every community who recognize that this is a housing shortage, and those are the people that I try to speak to. I think you know, a lot of the evidence in politics is that, you know, if you have 3 hours in the rest of your life to go, you know, convert someone from the KKK, like, okay, that's like a one person at a time kind of activism, but that's not scalable, as they say in tech. You know, there are enough people who already think that we should be building a lot of housing, especially in high-income, wealthy neighborhoods, and we just need to organize those people, and we just need to organize. Yeah.
I would love to hear John answer this question, because I feel like, as somebody who runs the planning department, okay, have you yeah, of course you do. So, have you felt like the conversation is so charged, right? Every project is so charged, and even the affordable housing projects are highly, highly contested in neighborhoods that are very pro-affordable housing. And I would be curious to hear, have you heard the conversation change? Has it become more sophisticated? Have you heard the western suburbs of San Francisco change their mind? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, there's multiple answers to that question. I mean, I think the conversation is changing, and I think partially because we are in more of a crisis mode than we have been for a long time, and there has been incredible regional and statewide conversation about this issue and about the need to build. So I have seen in the last year or two people who simply would say that the law of supply and demand does not apply to housing in the Bay Area, that concept doesn't apply, change their attitude about that. But that doesn't mean that people are accepting of new projects. And what's interesting actually is that we don't see the pushback at all, very much at all, about, for example, downtown. So in the 70s, while people were fighting high-rises in the downtown, we approved the board approved the transit center plan, and there was not one public speaker, and that enabled 9 million square feet of development, for example. But where the fights are is at the neighborhood level, and I think what we the way I like to describe it in the work of the planning department is that we spend 90% of our time in the planning department on 10% of the land in the city. It's the land where the change is happening, and I think where we have dropped the ball and is not addressing the whole other aspect of how we stabilize people in their homes and businesses in those neighborhoods that are changing, right? So, I mean, I really believe that while we do need to fight the good fight and we have a crisis situation where we have to scale up the kind of concepts that we're talking about, we also have to sit down and break bread with people who don't agree with us. So, you know, as an example, we have been doing a ton of work in the Mission, in Chinatown, in the Tenderloin, and I have what's called the community development staff now who is working on all these issues of stabilization and displacement issues and keeping people in their businesses and addressing eviction controls and tenant counseling. Not that we personally, as in the planning department, do this, but we do it. We've organized a citywide effort on this for two reasons. One, there's a human suffering going on that is incredible, right? 8,000 Latinos have left the Mission in 10 years, and that is not normal neighborhood turnover. That is serious displacement going on. So we have to deal with it. But the second reason is that it's the only way we're going to ever get support for adding to the housing stock in a huge way, right? So I think while the dialogue is shifting among populations, and I think that government has to address the other side of this crisis situation, and with respect to displacement, with respect to evictions, with respect to people losing their 50-year-old businesses, whatever it might be. And we haven't really tackled that side of the equation very much, because we've been all about growing. And I think that's great. We have to grow, we have to densify, all those things are great. But we haven't really addressed the other side of the coin.
So there's room for one more question. Professor Klaus?
Yeah, obviously, we are talking about a crisis that is very acute, and the rush for a solution is obvious. What concerns me is that in that rush of a solution of a pressing problem, whether or not we set actually the foundation for a future crisis in the following sense. We have seen today and all along during those visits to sites that the most change is from prior either military, Navy, or other older industrial, mostly waterfront properties. And that's the place, and we heard that from you, that most of the change is happening in the eastern section of San Francisco, if we stay for a moment in the city itself, but that applies to everywhere else. So I'm really concerned in the context of sea level rise that too much is really oriented to where we, 100 years from now, really setting ourselves up for a new crisis. And so what interests me, whether this infill in not the waterfront, but in existing neighborhoods, is really a way to avoid that future crisis where infill neighborhoods and mid-level elevations, from the topographical point of view, can be really more intensified and densified, and not run for the waterfront simply because it's available property right now. And I see that back in New York happening, and I see it here happening, and it really concerns me.
So we're gonna get Antonio.
So, thank you. So I'm one of, I think, the people Laura was talking about. I'm born and raised in San Francisco, and I've been evicted from my home here in San Francisco, no longer live here. I'm also on a design team. So that might make me unique. How many people here have been evicted or displaced against their will? Okay, we got one other person. So, a few other. I don't really have a very concretely data-driven way to talk about this because it is an incredibly emotional issue for me. It's my entire life. But I want to say first that I really appreciate what John, I think, from planning said about the fact that, yes, we can build all we want, but frankly, the history that many people here have talked about lucidly is one about capital determining development decisions structured by policies that distinctly oppress and suppress minorities and other people who are marginalizable, such as those who have low incomes. That's not history. That's happening today. So I feel like it's one thing to talk about the history of these policies and how they've influenced housing and these decisions. It's another to actively be working on dismantling those policies in the moment. And that's why I believe, as someone who's experienced not only evictions, but many movements of political persuasions that are not NIMBYs. We're not saying we don't want any sort of development. We're asking what development and for who. And those are real political questions that we've been raising again and again against specific policies and their implementation and their lack of implementation, such as the Eastern Neighborhoods Plan, not too far from here. So to me, it's not really a simple question of building more. We could argue forever about whether the supply and demand works for housing. I'm not going to be convinced because I've read too much, basically too much Marxist theory to believe your neoliberal stuff. But I think that even though I definitely agree with densifying cities, fully in agreement with that, and the issue to me more is about the question of who's at the table to make these decisions. Why are certain kinds of decisions made over others on a consistent basis? And so the question about showing up to hearings, I think it's weird and ironic, Laura, that you talk about the need to build a political movement when I've seen one that's for decades fought for sane policies around planning and the protection of tenants from eviction, and we've received basically no support from the people who seem to be supporting your organization right now. San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Organization was San Francisco Planning and Urban Renewal Organization originally. There's a whole book about this called The City for Sale by Chester Hartman, which has very clear examples of how these kinds of organizations have been formed to create a city of the wealthy. So this isn't incidental that it's happened. It's not just something that's happened to us. It's created. And so I feel like I really appreciate a lot of the things that have been said tonight. They were surprising to me to hear, especially from Laura, because I feel like I was expecting a lot more of that argument. But I guess the one thing I would say is that we've talked about the need to prioritize marginalized people. Where are those people in your organization? Where are those people in your conversations? Where are those people on your planning staff? Is it just community engagement, or do those people actually have positions of power in your institution? That's a question for me. I don't know, but from my experience, generally, there is a systematic not paying attention to those people and their ideas, and there's an assumption that experts have the data who can decide things for communities, and that's the data which is dispassionately looked at somehow gets to decide. And I dispute that because I've seen the impacts of this supposedly data-driven decision-making, which has destroyed my ability to live in the city that I grew up in. So I definitely agree that we should build infill, totally in agreement with that. I think the question is who gets to live there? And that is not something that we can just say any unit is a good unit if we want to actually serve the most marginalized first, to assure that if we want to build affordable housing, we're actually building affordable housing. And then the question is, of course, where does the capital come from, which comes back to policies, essentially. So I think that's the challenge for us, is figuring out how do we affect policies through a design.
Well, testify, Fran, because I appreciate you, I do. I guess I would respond to your comments in a way that, again, I feel like, I personally spend a lot of time thinking about this, working on this. I work with homeless families every single day where we're trying to give voice and experience to make sure that they are participating in these kinds of discussions. But I guess I would just answer by saying, I think that the housing crisis is actually an affordability crisis. We're actually not going to build our way out of this problem. We haven't been able to. In fact, Carol's data shows us how, in fact, we're declining in our production goals. And so what we also talk about is how do we preserve neighborhoods, and how do we make sure that people who are in community stay in community? How do we make sure they're included in the work that we're doing? But I also think it's about, there are going to be other anti-poverty interventions that have to be tied to what we do around housing. There's no silver bullet about increasing a low-income person's household income unless we focus on how do we do workforce development, job training, education. Education still dictates outcomes of success for every low-income community in the country, still. every day. It's the number one indicator about what kind of wealth outcomes you will have. And if we are intentionally undereducating our low-income communities of color, we're going to have the same kind of impact. So I don't want us to leave here thinking that there's a singular strategy, a silver bullet. This is, in no offense, an incredibly complex issue, and we have to figure out how to create simple language for folks to get engaged in understanding that there are trade-offs, there are contradictions, there are, nuances that regular old folk who are being evicted every single day, and just so we know, the most vulnerable folks around eviction are people who are actually going to end up homeless. So the correlation between figuring out prevention strategies, preservation strategies, and production strategies in tandem, I think is where we need to focus. Because if you take any one of these as a priority, I think you're going to have minimal impact in impacting the goals at scale.
Yeah, I want to respond to both your thoughts. Two things. The anti-displacement policies do not have to be, we need good anti-displacement strategies, right? You can do all of that, and if you don't build anything, we're not going to solve the broader housing affordability issue. You can build all you want, and you will start to solve the broader housing affordability issue, but you're not going to solve the displacement problem. They are two different but interconnected, and you need strategies for both, because I'll just go back to, there isn't evidence that it is new construction that is causing the displacement. In fact, if anything, it is the lack of new construction and all the people that we have that are putting more and more pressure on the rental market. And at least right now, we live in a market-based system, in the country, and there is never going to be enough public subsidy. Tamika was talking about how, the HUD budget, just pure public subsidy to subsidize all the, quote, affordable housing you would need. I mean, at extremely low incomes, you can't afford the cost of maintenance of the unit, right? I mean, that's a fact. So, you've got to look at these as different strategies. And then I want to go back to the waterfront versus intensifying infill. I do, because I think it's really important that we should mention this, that the movement to do more accessory dwelling units, to open up single-family zoning to more, smaller scale strategies in those single-family neighborhoods and intensify them in a number of ways, I think is a really important and growing strategy, not just in San Francisco, but in lots of communities that I think is an important one to focus on. But again, I think you have to do that, and you also have to develop on lots of other larger parcels in order to solve this deficit of housing that we have. And we have to do it in more creative ways. We don't have to have as large a units. I mean, there's all kinds of things that the designers should be thinking about there. But I think we shouldn't automatically take the waterfront off the table. I think we should be thinking about how we do it in a way that is going to end up being resilient when the sea level rise happens, right? And I think that's a huge challenge because it's clearly going to be expensive solutions unless some of you are even more creative than I think. And I know you're really creative. So.
Can I have a last line?
No, sorry. We really, everyone has to
tomorrow morning early, so we really need to respect people's time. So
Okay, well, I just want to thank all of our presenters and thank all of you guys. There's an amazing amount of passion in the room around these topics, and I know that we have so many more questions for everyone here, but it's great to know that sometimes crisis asks us to rethink the way that we do things, and it's really up to us now in the challenge to rethink this through the designs. So thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you to RBD.